Hi, this is Kim, and this is a brief introduction to plants. We will look briefly at the characteristics that all plants on land share, and we will look at some challenges that plants faced when they evolved from aquatic algae. We will look at some basic ecological principles and just quickly look at the four major groups of plants. Again, this is just meant to be a very introductory lecture. So why are plants so important? Plants are hugely important in the food chain on Earth. Remember that plants are called the producers. They're called the producers because they produce food for the rest of the food chain through photosynthesis. So through photosynthesis, remember the plants take energy from the sun and produce carbohydrates for the entire rest of the food chain. So all other life in the food chain depends on plants being able to produce these carbohydrates through photosynthesis. That means in terms of biomass, we need mostly plants in an ecosystem. And that's what this pyramid is showing you, is we need mostly plants in this ecosystem. Otherwise, there's not enough food available for all of the other levels. So looking at this food pyramid here, this food chain, these primary consumers are also called the herbivores. So herbivores are the organisms that eat the plants, they eat the producers. And then everyone above that are called the carnivores. So these secondary consumers, these could also be called primary carnivores. And these are called the secondary carnivores. Sorry, that's a C. Oops, it's supposed to be an eraser. What's significant also in this pyramid is realizing that at each step in this food chain, there's a huge amount of energy lost. In fact, only 10% of the energy available in those plants is transferred to the herbivores. And then only 10% of the energy available in the herbivores is transferred to the carnivores. So let's look at that. Starting with the sunlight. This shows 1 million joules of energy available in the sunlight, and only 10% of that is transferred to the next level, to the producers. And then you can see only 10% of that energy available in the plants is then transferred. Sorry. So 10% of the energy is available in the sunlight is transferred to the plants. And then only 10% of that is transferred to the herbivores. So the further up the food chain you eat, the less energy you're getting from your food. So by the time we get to these secondary carnivores, in other words, he ate the guy who ate the guy who ate the plant, there's not much energy available. If you look at 1 million joules available in the sunlight and only 10 joules are being transferred to this highest level shown on this food pyramid. That means we need mostly plants in an ecosystem. So plants are incredibly important in the food chain. Again, they produce the food that gets transferred through the rest of the food chain. No one else can directly use that energy available in the sunlight. Second reason that plants are so incredibly important is plants produce oxygen and take in carbon dioxide. Both of those things are very important. Let's talk about oxygen first. Plants produce our oxygen. Plants have produced our atmosphere. The early Earth did not have oxygen. It was all produced by the photosynthetic single-celled protists and bacteria that were releasing oxygen into our atmosphere. Plants also take in CO2. A healthy ecosystem would have a balance in which there was not excess CO2 being produced, but obviously humans have changed that for the earth as our CO2 emissions continue to increase. And you can see this really shows the different contributing factors right now, the major contributing CO2 emitters on Earth. This is a big problem because obviously this is what is contributing significantly to global warming. And we will continue during our lifetimes, and especially during yours, to see greater and greater impacts of global warming on our everyday life. As food becomes more scarce, plants and animals become extinct, ocean water levels are going to rise, storms are going to become more intense. It's going to continue to be a problem. Malaria is going to continue to spread to areas it wasn't before as those areas continue to warm. In a healthy, functioning Earth, we would have enough plants to take in the excess CO2. The problem is we're also doing this, deforestation. So we're reducing the ability of the Earth to produce oxygen. We are reducing the ability of the Earth to take in the CO2. Why are we deforesting? The major reason, at least in the Amazon rainforest, but also globally, a major reason is cattle ranching. The blue is cattle ranching. It shows that 65 to 70% of the Amazon rainforest is destroyed to raise cattle. That red pie, the red piece of the pie, this is for crops, but a lot of those crops are grown for the cattle, not for people. So that really even further contributes to the impact of cows on the rainforest. As a just quick side story, I just wanted to really emphasize the impact of cows on the earth, not just on plants, but on other aspects of the earth as well. But let's start with just the plant part of the story. This is just in the US. We raise 41 million tons of food to feed to cows, and it only produces 7 million tons of food in exchange. That seems kind of counterproductive. And most people, pretty well believe that if we used all of that food to feed people instead of feeding the cows, there would be no one hungry on Earth. The amount of food we feed to raise 1 pound of beef compared to 1 pound of other animals is astronomical. Cows have a huge impact on our Earth. The amount of water they use, the amount of food they eat, the pollution they produce in terms of methane gas, and how their poop contaminates the groundwater supply, the pollution that is produced in refrigerating the beef, transporting the beef. It's a huge impact on our globe. This just shows the amount of water it takes to raise 1 pound of beef versus 1 pound of our other food products. And even if you just compare it to chickens and pigs, I know people go, well, look, cow is bigger. But no, we're talking to raise 1 pound of beef. It takes 1,847 gallons of water compared to 39 gallons to raise 1 pound of vegetables, 518 to raise 1 pound of chicken, 717 to raise 1 pound of pig. So beef takes a lot of water, it takes a lot of food. And again, the land we use to raise food for our cows could be used to raise food to feed people. The exchange isn't an equitable exchange in terms of how much food it takes to produce such a relatively small amount of food in exchange. This just shows you methane emissions, which again, methane is another gas that's contributing to global warming. So that's a big deal. Okay, enough about cows. Another reason that plants are so important is obviously we do eat them also. And we should be mostly eating plants in our diet. I'm not advocating a vegetarian diet necessarily, but Plants are obviously incredibly important to our health, the phytochemicals for fighting cancer, building our immune system, keeping us healthy, all the vitamins and minerals that come from plants, incredibly important. Medicinal plants. I've highlighted a few here that you've probably heard of. Now, these aren't herbal remedies. Of course, I could do a whole chart just on herbal remedies, but these are just a few of the hundreds of pharmaceutical products that are derived directly from plants. So aspirin, I'm sure you've all taken probably at some point during your life, maybe. Caffeine, many of you have caffeine as part of your daily diet that is derived directly from plants. Pseudoephedrine is an antihistamine. These last three that are highlighted are chemotherapy drugs. So lots of important drugs that save human lives are derived directly from plants. They say that for every plant that goes extinct in the rainforest, we have lost the possible ability to harvest those chemicals and analyze them to see if they could possibly cure a disease, save human life. And again, herbal remedies, a lot of people use lots and lots of herbal remedies that are derived directly from plants, and I just didn't put that up here. And then there's, of course, the aesthetic value of plants, the peace in looking at nature and looking at plants, the mental relaxation, the happiness that plants bring us. Imagine our lives without them. So I know that biologically speaking, they're not the most exciting topic. Most people are much more interested in learning about animals than learning about plants, but plants are incredibly important. So I think you should know a little bit about them. Land plants evolved from a specific type of freshwater green algae called the charophytes. So those are believed to be the ancestors of all living plants. Again, these are freshwater algae. Most algae that we learned about in the protist lecture were the saltwater, the marine algae, but these are freshwater algae. And imagine that you are an algae and you're floating in water, you're bathed in nutrients and gases and you're supported, and now you're moving on to land. A lot of things are going to be a challenge on land. So let's just quickly think about what some of those challenges are as you move on to land, because animals are going to face similar challenges as they move on to land. If you're no longer surrounded by water, drying out is going to be a huge challenge on land. So I'm going to list that as our number one challenge on land, and that is desiccation. Desiccation is an interesting word. It has two C's in the middle, and it really means drying out. Land plants had to develop some strategies for conserving water to keep them from drying out. Remember, plants must have water to carry out photosynthesis. So drying out is a big deal for plants. Support. If you're no longer surrounded by water, support is going to be a big deal. And plants had to develop structures for support on land. Transport of gases, nutrients, water. If you're no longer bathed in all of this, you're going to have to find a way to transport it to your tissues. Reproduction. If you're bathed in water, the egg and sperm can just swim to each other very easily. But now you're on land, fertilization is going to be more of a challenge. So we'll talk about how the various groups of plants have tried to solve these different problems on land. What are the basic plant characteristics? Well, plants are multicellular. So the algae that we looked at in the protus lecture, remember algae are mostly unicellular. They can be colonial, but they don't have distinct tissues. So plants are multicellular, plus they have different tissues, which are cells working together to perform similar functions. Plants are all autotrophs, meaning they make their own food. And specifically, plants are what are called photoautotrophs, meaning they use light energy from the sun to make their own food, to make carbohydrates. Plant cells all have cell walls made of cellulose. Plants have chloroplasts. Remember, this is where photosynthesis takes place. And lastly, plants have a life cycle in which there is something called alternation of generations. What this means, there are times when the plant tissue is all made of cells that have half the normal number of chromosomes. And remember, that's called the haploid number. The N number of chromosomes. And there are times when the entire plant is made of cells with the haploid number of chromosomes. Then there are other times when the entire plant has cells that are made of the diploid number of chromosomes, the double number, the 2N number. And when we look at the life cycle of the plants, you'll see that depending on what type of plant we're talking about, they might spend most of their life with just the haploid number and then another part of their life as the diploid. Then other plants spend most of their life with the diploid number. Remember that in animals, such as ourselves, the only cells in our body that have the haploid number are the gametes, the eggs and sperm. But that's not the case in plants. So that's something very different. As plants moved onto land, they obviously faced some challenges that we just talked about. One of the ways that plants guard against losing water is they are able to control the opening and closing of these pore-like structures in the leaves called the stomates, the stomata. So this is one stoma. Stoma is singular and stomata is plural. And this is where the plant takes in CO2 into the plant tissue for photosynthesis. So these have to be open at some point during the day for this plant to be able to carry out photosynthesis. But as that's open, they're losing water. Water loss in plants is called transpiration. And remember, plants need that water to carry out photosynthesis. So plants have to have this constant balancing act between taking in CO2 and losing too much water. Most plants close those stoma at night and open them during the day, but there are plants who live in really hot environments and have to really balance opening and closing those stomates, those stoma, I keep calling them stomates, the stoma, opening and closing their stomata to control water loss. And they do that with these cells called guard cells. Okay, so these little sausage-shaped things, these are the guard cells. And the guard cells regulate opening and closing of the stomata. To reduce water loss. So this is one of the strategies that plants developed on land. Now, the first groups of plants we're going to look at, the mosses, do not have this. It's going to be starting with the ferns that we're going to get leaves that have these openings that are going to be regulated by the guard cells. Another way that plants solve these problems on land is by having vascular tissue. And this is going to be for transport of water, gases, and nutrients. And the earliest plants are not going to have this. It's going to be the more advanced plants that are going to have this. So going back to our challenges on land drying out, one of the ways that plants are going to avoid that water loss is by being able to regulate the opening and closing of these openings in the leaf that bring in the CO2. Another problem was transport and support. And vascular tissue is really going to kind of solve both of those problems. So transport, and it's also going to offer support. So that vascular tissue is really solving two of those problems. The other thing that's going to provide support is going to be the development of some pretty complex structures: stems, leaves, and roots as part of that vascular system. Obviously, when you look at a typical plant, as you know, the roots are below the soil, and those are going to take in water and nutrients into the roots. And then we're going to use that, well, we aren't, but the plant is going to use that vascular tissue to transport those materials from the roots up the stem, and I'll draw a flowering plant here, and into the leaves. So that vascular tissue is going to be incredibly important for support and for moving materials around. The other problem we talked about was reproduction. And the early plants are going to struggle with this. The early plants are going to require water for egg and sperm to come together. It's not until the development of the seed that this problem is really solved. So plants with seeds are going to have a huge advantage over those plants who don't have seeds. And we're going to see that in a minute. This is just a more detailed picture of how plants transport materials through their vascular tissue. The most advanced plants, which are mostly what are called the gymnosperms and the angiosperms, which we're going to see in a minute, have this complex system of two types of vascular tissue transporting material. They have what's called the xylem. So this is pronounced xylem. And the xylem moves water and materials, and it's only in one direction. So it's moving it up from the roots to stems and leaves. And it's only in one direction, so one way only. The phloem is going to move organic molecules. So this is going to include the sugars that the plant needs to move from tissue to tissue. This is the food of the plant. Why do they need the sugars? To carry out cell respiration, to make ATP. Plants need ATP to carry out chemical reactions, just like animals do, just like fungi, bacteria. All living organisms need ATP to carry out chemical reactions in the cell. The difference is phloem is also two-way movement. There are some other differences too, but those are the two that I want you to know. So xylem is moving water and minerals, and it's only one way. Phloem is moving sugars and other organic molecules, and it is two-way movement. So this is part, again, of the vascular system of the more advanced plants. So we're going to talk about 4 major groups of plants. I'm going to go ahead and show you a sneak preview of what those are. The bryophyta, which are the mosses, and these are the most primitive plants that we're going to look at. We're going to look at the ferns, what are called the gymnosperms. Now, these phylum names are kind of funky on this slide, but I liked the picture, so I put it on there. But we're going to call these the gymnosperms. Okay, and then we're going to call these flowering plants the angiosperms. I don't want you to know the scientific names of the plants. So we're not going to learn the phylum names, the class names, order names, anything like that. I just want you to know the 4 major groups. Now the bryophytes actually include more than just the mosses, but we're going to use mosses as our example. So the mosses, the ferns, the gymnosperms, and the angiosperms. The angiosperms are the flowering plants. And they are the most advanced plants on Earth. They're most successful plants on Earth, the most number of species. Okay, the gymnosperms, these are all the plants with cones. And I think most of you are familiar with mosses and ferns, but we'll look at them in a little more detail. Before we do that, though, I need to give you a couple of terms related to the life cycle of a plant. I mentioned before that there are going to be times in the life cycle of a plant where all of the cells are diploid and other than all of the cells are haploid. So let's look at that in a little more detail. I'm going to blow this up a little bit bigger. So this is the very general life cycle of a plant. Each type of plant has a specific spin on this. Okay, so let's look for a second. We have gametes that are haploid. Okay, that's pretty typical of a living organism that has sexual reproduction. So you would have eggs and you would have sperm. Eggs are haploid and the sperm are haploid. And when they come together through fertilization, you have a zygote that is now diploid, the 2N number of chromosomes. Remember that a zygote goes through mitosis, which is cell division, and produces a lot of 2N cells. This stage in the life cycle of a plant is called the sporophyte. The sporophyte stage is diploid. Those cells have the double number of chromosomes, the diploid number of chromosomes. Eventually, those cells go through meiosis. And remember that meiosis is reduction division. Remember, in our cells, we only go through meiosis to produce eggs and sperm. But in plants, they're going to take these cells that are 2N and go through a reduction division to produce spores. And those spores have the haploid number of chromosomes. Now, here's what's different. Those spores are going to go through mitosis and divide into a lot of haploid cells. And that stage of the plant life cycle is called the gametophyte stage. It's called the gametophyte because eventually those cells are going to make eggs and sperm. But in some plants, including the mosses that we're about to look at, the mosses, that moss that you see, that carpet-like of green that you see in the forest or on maybe even rocks in your yard, if it's an area that gets a lot of water and shade, that whole plant is a gametophyte. All of the cells of that moss have half the number of chromosomes. And eventually those produce eggs and sperm, which come together and produce a zygote, which is of course diploid. So keeping that in mind, let's look at the mosses. So here's some beautiful green moss growing, and moss is what we call gametophyte dominant, meaning that the plant you see there All of those cells are haploid cells. Moss does not have any vascular tissue. What that means, no root system, no stems, no leaves. It's very simple in structure. It doesn't produce seeds, which means it requires water for reproduction. Egg and sperm must come together, and that requires a droplet of water for the sperm to swim to the egg. Yes, plants have eggs and sperm, as I showed you in that life cycle diagram a minute ago. So mosses, because they don't have seeds, they do require water for reproduction. There is a stage called the sporophyte, which again, remember, that's the 2N stage, meaning that's when the cells are diploid. But the major stage is the gametophyte stage, the N stage. But this is showing you that the sporophyte actually grows out of the gametophyte. And if you look at moss close up, different times of year, you'll see these sporophytes growing out of the gametophyte on the moss. So these are the most primitive plants that we have on Earth today in terms of their simplicity. Very, very simple in structure. Okay, the next advancement comes in the ferns. For one thing, the ferns are now what we call sporophyte dominant, meaning the plant you actually see here is the sporophyte, and those cells are 2N cells. When we say sporophyte dominant, it means it spends most of its life in the sporophyte stage, and that's the plant you see is the sporophyte. Versus the moss, that plant you see there, that's the gametophyte. The moss spend most of their life as the gametophyte, which is, of course, the haploid. The ferns were the first with true vascular tissue. So they were the first to have roots, stems, and leaves. So now these plants can get bigger. If you have a way to transport materials, you can get larger. They still don't have seeds though, so they still require water for reproduction because again, sperm must swim to the egg. I want to show you a picture of that in a fern because it's pretty interesting. So the spores are on the underside of the leaf in a structure called a sorus. And this is where the spores are. And looking at the life cycle of a fern, you can see what's going to happen as those spores are going to divide and grow into the gametophyte, which is then going to produce the eggs and sperm. Fertilization will occur, and that sporophyte is actually going to grow out of the gametophyte. So that fern that you see growing, the whole mature fern, is actually growing out of the gametophyte. Let's look at that gametophyte. It's pretty interesting. So this is a fern gametophyte, and we have female and male reproductive structures on this gametophyte. Remember, the gametophyte produces the gametes. The antheridia, these are going to be the male gametes. In other words, the sperm are going to get produced here. And the archegonium, this is where the female gametes are going to get produced. In other words, the egg. The sperm need to swim to the egg, so water is required for reproduction. Let's go back to the life cycle. So looking at this life cycle, this is the mature fern, and on the underside in this sorus are the spores. Those spores get released and they start dividing, and out of them grows the gametophyte. So this came from the spores. As it matures, the sperm are going to get released from the antheridium, and the egg is going to get released from the archegonium, and those have to come together for fertilization, and that requires water. Once fertilization has happened, now we have diploid tissue. That zygote is going to divide into the sporophyte, and that's the mature plant that we see. So ferns are more advanced than mosses because they have vascular tissue, and so now they can get bigger. They can more effectively, more efficiently transport materials through the tissues. The next group are going to be the first to have seeds. These are the gymnosperms. Gymnosperm means naked seed. So these are the first with seeds, and the seeds are in a cone. They're called naked seeds because they're not encased in a fruit. They have a more efficient vascular system, so they can get larger. So they have xylem and phloem. A very well-developed vascular system, so they can get much, much larger. And for the first time, plants don't require water for reproduction because they have seeds. They can grow in really harsh climates because they have special adaptations for that. Needles are leaves. If you've ever looked at pine needles, this is a modified leaf. What's amazing about this is they're not shed in the winter. And they can still conduct photosynthesis even with this reduced size, a very modified leaf. It doesn't dry out, it resists desiccation. It's really strong in wind, so it resists damage in wind because it doesn't have a broad surface area. Imagine a big giant leaf and the wind would just get shredded, right? It doesn't hold snow as well as a big broad leaf would. So lots of adaptations for living in cold, windy areas. It's important to realize that these gymnosperms actually have female cones and male cones. If you've ever looked at a pine tree, these big cones that fall off, those are the female cones. But if you look really closely, you can see the male cones too. This is where pollen are produced, and the pollen contain the sperm. That pollen needs to go to the female cone to fertilize the egg. Eggs are in the female cone. What's really cool about pine pollen is it has these little wings for wind dispersal, and it really looks like a Mickey Mouse ears hat. These are designed for wind dispersal. Huge advantage in many situations if you can cross-pollinate. Cross-pollination is going to lead to genetic diversity in plants. In other words, you're not self-fertilizing. If you can have pollen from one plant go through the wind and fertilize a different plant, you're going to get more genetic diversity, and your population is going to be more resistant to environmental changes. Genetic diversity is extremely important in any population of organisms. So this was a huge advancement in plants to be able to have that pollen get dispersed, have that sperm now go to a completely different individual in the population so that we're getting cross-pollination. Okay, and finally, the last group of plants are the angiosperms, the flowering plants. They are also sporophyte dominant, and obviously the most successful dominant plants on Earth. Their big advancement is that they have flowers and the seed is protected in a fruit. That fruit is going to protect the seed. It's going to entice other organisms to come eat the fruit and disperse the seeds. And if you can attract pollinators, you are going to get even more cross-pollination, which again gives you genetic diversity, which is a huge survival advantage. Remember, it's the population that's important. So you want some individuals to be resistant and different so that they can survive as the environment changes. So it might get more cold, or it might be more hot, or it might be that there's a pathogen that comes through and you have individuals that are resistant to that pathogen. Having genetic diversity is key to long-term survival, and cross-pollination really helps with that. Flowers attract pollinators. A lot of different flowering plants have developed very close-knit relationships with their pollinators. So here you can see 3 different kinds of pollinators. So this would be an insect, the bee. We have birds, we have different kinds of mammals that are pollinators. And angiosperms and their pollinators have co-evolved. In fact, there are plants that only one specific species of organism has the mouth parts or the body parts that are exactly the right size and shape to pollinate them. Huge advantage to having this close relationship. If you're a plant and you're counting on cross-pollination, if this bee is only visiting your species, then that means your pollen is only going to get transferred to your own species. If this bee is visiting a bunch of different kinds of flowers and picking up pollen, then your pollen could get wasted, could go to a completely different species. That's not going to do you any good. There's a huge advantage to having these really close relationships. The advantage for the pollinator is it can count on that one food supply. It knows where to go. The problem is if something happens to one of these organisms in this story, then that's really devastating. So if something happens to the pollinator, the plants die out. Something happens to the plant, the pollinator dies out. We have a huge crash of pollinators on Earth right now, and I'm going to talk about that again in a minute. I've got another slide about that. Same thing goes for seed dispersal. Flowering plants have developed these really amazing mechanisms for seed dispersal. This poor dog with these burrs on it makes me laugh. But some seeds actually have to pass through the gut of a mammal in order to be able to germinate. They can't germinate unless they pass through the digestive system of a mammal. Obviously, that animal's probably going to pass that seed out of its body somewhere else. So that's a really good mechanism for dispersal. Having structures that make you stick to the fur of an animal, that's going to help with dispersal. Different wing type mechanisms for wind dispersal. I just talked very briefly about how we have this huge problem on Earth right now, that something is happening to our pollinators. And that's a big deal because almost all of our food crops depend on pollinators. In fact, there are areas where farmers release bees during certain times of the year to pollinate their food crops. Most of our food crops will die out if we don't have pollinators. That's a pretty big deal. Okay, not to mention the food supply for all of the other animals on Earth, right? It's not just about us. The food chain is going to collapse in a lot of cases if we don't have pollinators. What's happening to our pollinators? Lots of things. Habitat loss, pesticides, climate change, invasive species that are killing them, pathogens and parasites that we're bringing in. It's a really big deal. on Earth right now, what's happening to our pollinators. So just kind of be aware of that. This is a quote that's from the article in Time magazine. Humans depend on plants, and plants depend on pollinators. A balance must be maintained in order to sustain life on Earth and protect human survival and health. It's a big deal. Okay, one more ecological principle of sorts that I just wanted to mention to you is GMOs. What does GMO stand for? I'm sure you've heard of it. It stands for genetically modified organism. So it doesn't just pertain to crops and plants. It could be farm-grown fish. Could be a lot of different things. But I know you've heard about GMOs, and I know that a lot of products have labels now that say they're not GMO so that people somehow feel safer. I saw the other day a bottle of like spray disinfectant, kitchen cleaner spray that said non-GMO on it. So we've kind of reached an extreme. It's kind of like the gluten-free products have the label now. Everything has a non-GMO label. Well, most of our food plants today have been genetically modified. That's how we got that plant. Okay. Golden beets didn't just grow wild in the forest and we went out and harvested them. We have genetically engineered most of our crop plants, especially corn. Corn was the earliest one. But there are a lot of benefits to genetically modified organisms. They require fewer pesticides to be applied because they're more resistant to pesticide damage. Well, that's good. We don't want pesticides on our food. We don't want pesticides getting into the groundwater, into the food chain. The effects of pesticides are astronomical. GMOs use less water. They require less maintenance. They require fewer chemicals to make them grow, such as fertilizers. They can actually have higher nutritional value. They require less land, so they can be more efficiently grown. We can grow more crops in the same amount of land, mostly because we're having less crop loss, but there are other reasons for it too. So there are advantages to GMOs. It's going to continue to be a big controversial issue on Earth as the population grows and we need to feed our people. So, there are pros and cons to GMOs, but in most cases, we don't need to fear them. They've been around forever, and most of us have not been adversely affected in any way by GMOs. So just be aware that there are a lot of food crops today that are mostly GMO. So almost all corn and soy are genetically modified in some way. Same for rice. This just gives you the top 10 foods that are genetically modified. Canola oil, cottonseed, potatoes, tomatoes, dairy products, peas. And there are some benefits. I mean, they can add vitamins to rice, to the rice supply, through inserting the gene to produce vitamin A. They can cause rice to produce vitamin A and save the eyesight of millions of people in third world countries where they mostly eat rice and they don't get vitamin A in their diet, and children go blind. So this is a big deal in some parts of the world to be able to genetically modify that rice supply and add that gene that can save the vision of humans. They can also add other genes to increase nutritional value of foods in places where the food supply is short and they don't get to go to Whole Foods and buy $200 worth of expensive vegetables and fruits every week. So anyway, I just wanted to throw in the whole GMO thing at the end of our plant lecture so you kind of were aware of that. There are lots of pros and cons. Lots of people say, that it is good for the environment to have GMOs because they reduce pollution in many ways. And again, just the fact that we can grow those crops on less land is supposedly better for the environment. But you can do the research yourself and see what you think. I personally don't care about GMOs. It's not something that bothers me in any way. I will never look for the GMO label on my food because I don't fear GMOs. I think a lot of science and research goes into these crops before they're allowed to be grown and put into our food supply. I do trust the system. I don't think that I'm going to die from eating GMOs. I do think it saves lots of lives on Earth, and eventually we're going to need this as we continue to try to feed a growing population of humans on Earth. Okay, so that's the plants. That's what you need to know. Thanks.